Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this lecture in the God and the Good series organized by the Cathedral and the Department of Philosophy. My name is Henk de Berg. I'm a professor in the School of Languages and Cultures and one of the two directors, together with Henk de Berg, of the Prokhorov Center, which sponsors this lecture series. Our speaker today is Giles Fraser. As usual, we'll have the lecture first, and then there will be a question and answer session. That session will be led by my colleague Bob Stern, professor in the Department of Philosophy. I know it's still a while to go, but I do want to take this opportunity and draw your attention to our next God and the Good lecture. It will be delivered by Karen Armstrong and will take place here in the Cathedral on Tuesday, the 26th of May. Today's speaker, as I mentioned, is Giles Fraser. Giles Fraser is an Anglican priest, journalist, and broadcaster. His PhD was on Nietzsche, the 19th century German philosopher who famously declared, "God is dead." I should add that Nietzsche went mad towards the end of his life and then spent 11 years in a mental asylum. In case you're wondering, this is not to suggest that this was some form of divine punishment. God works in mysterious ways, but I don't think he works in quite that way. Among Giles's former occupations are lecturer in philosophy at Oxford, visiting professor at the London School of Economics, and Canon Chancellor of St. Paul's Cathedral. Now, those of you who are regular attenders of our lecture series know that I usually tell a little joke before I hand over to the speaker. I haven't got a real joke today, but more of an anecdote or something to think about, kind of related to Nietzsche's God is dead. So here goes. 3 Anglican priests I want to train. The first one says, "If God did not exist, we would be travelers without a destination." To which the second priest replies, "More than that, if God did not exist, we wouldn't even exist." To which the third priest says, "Even more, if God did not exist, not even God would exist." I've always found that very deep. But now, please welcome Giles Fraser.
Thank you very much. It's a great joy to be back here in Sheffield Cathedral. I realised that the last time I came here was actually 13 years ago, in 2007, and some of you may have been here. There was a service for Sheffield Football Club for the 150th anniversary, would it be, of Sheffield Football Club, the oldest football club in the world. And all the sort of football top brass came here for that service. And I stood up there and I preached a sermon, I thought it was quite a fiery sermon, about football corruption. And as I was standing out there, and I thought I'd really pressed the point home and I made them squirm a little bit. And as I was standing out there shaking hands, Sepp Blatter, the chairman of FIFA, came up and shook my hand and looked me in the eye and said, "I know exactly what you mean." I have to tell you, sermons don't really work. It's a joy to be coming and talking about the subject of Christianity and morality, a story of an uneasy relationship. And I'd like to begin with 2 short passages from the Gospel of St. Matthew. First, this one. "You've heard that it was said to the people long ago, 'You shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment.' But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or a sister will be subject to judgment, and anyone who says, 'You fool,' will be in danger of hellfire." There's a sentence, if you know your Bible well, there's a sentence in the middle that I've just missed out where it says something like, "And if you say raca to your brother, you're in trouble." And it's a real problematic thing because no one knows what raca means as a translation. There's no known translation to raca, so I don't know if we've been saying that to each other or not. Okay, then there's this passage which comes just a little bit later, which is equally excessive. You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away." Okay, let's take this second passage. According to Matthew's Jesus, it's not just physical adultery that is wrong, but even looking lustfully gets counted as adultery. And this, of course, presents something of a problem, because there is an aspect to the way we notice the physical appearance of another that feels like it is beyond our control. Yes, some religious people talk about maintaining what they call a custody of the eyes, if you've heard that phrase before, taking responsibility for what one looks at and how one looks at it. So, for instance, deliberately looking someone up and down, how the phrase goes, undressing them with your eyes, that's an act of considered will and so can be resisted. And because it's resistible, then we can see how it might be subject to moral consideration. But nonetheless, you don't have to be Freud to recognize that much of the ordinary, everyday social interaction between people has an aspect of the erotic to it that is impossible to eradicate. It might well be the thought is father to the deed. I understand that. But is it really adultery for me to notice the colour of your lipstick, or to be temporarily distracted by the dangling of your earring? And should I really be gouging out my eye if my visual attention wanders a little from the strict contemplation of higher things? Now, of course, if you want to, you can make every effort to interpret Jesus' words in such a way to return them to the realm of the possible. Yet I'm always slightly suspicious of the attempt to bend Scripture so that it fits in with our capacity to meet it. Instead, what I want to suggest here is the possibility that Jesus is deliberately trying to provoke what I'm going to call a crisis of capacity. That is, he wants us to feel that we cannot do what morality demands, and that morality isn't sufficient to deal with situations such as this. Indeed, I'll go a bit further. He deliberately wants us to feel like moral failures. And he does so because he's pointing to something beyond morality. Remember when Jesus meets the rich young man? He's done everything that the law demands, but Jesus requires more. He asks him to sell all his possessions and give the money to the poor. When he heard this, he went away sorrowful, is how Matthew describes the young man's perfectly understandable reaction. And just to make the point even clearer, Jesus follows this up with the story about camels and eyes of needles. Jesus seems to demand what cannot be done, or at least what cannot be reasonably expected. In 1972, the Australian philosopher Peter Singer published a justifiably famous essay under the title Famine, Affluence and Morality. This essay, entirely secular in its assumptions, can also be read as a challenging reflection on the upper limits of conventional morality. Singer tells what's become a well-known story about saving a drowning child in a shallow lake. Faced with such a situation, the vast majority of us would wade in to save the child, even if that meant getting our clothes muddy or even ruining them. After all, what's the price of a new suit compared to the life of a drowning child? But Singer goes on, pressing us towards the limits of our altruism. There are children dying all the time, he reflects, and of these diseases that we could easily prevent. If a $200 suit is a small price to pay for the life of the child, why don't we donate $200 to a charity that could use it to save others? And if $200, why not $2,000? Why not $200,000? Is the child in the lake before you really of more importance than a child dying the other side of the world? Of course not, Singer argues. Indeed, why don't we sell everything we have and give it to save at-risk children all over the world? Something happens to us at the upper levels of the moral demand, and by us I really do mean me included. As this demand intensifies, we begin to look for a way out, for alibis. Charities are wasteful, we say. The money does not go to the people who need it. And as the demand keeps on increasing, we begin to feel that what morality is demanding of us isn't just goodness, but something akin to impossibility. That our own destruction and that of our families is being threatened. Singer has inserted a wedge into our altruistic instincts and is forcing the door ever wider, and we rightly feel what might come towards us through this ever-widening space. What began as a simple act of goodness, saving the child from the lake, ends up with the threat of personal catastrophe. Saints, it seems to me, are people to be afraid of. In other words, the moral life bears within itself a continual demand to do more and more, a demand that presses us towards a crisis within ourselves, a crisis created by the fear that what is being demanded is something we are unable to bear. That's perhaps why we so regularly praise what one might call little morality, the every little counts type of morality, the doing your bit morality, the good deed for the day morality. One might also, I suppose, call this bourgeois morality, not to demean it, but to recognize that when one ventures to the extremes of moral demand, we begin to worry that our conventional lives are being threatened. To give £100 to charity is one thing, fine. To give away everything you have and survive by living out of the bins before going to work so that you can earn even more and give it away, that sort of morality could be understood as almost a threat to the social fabric. A husband that gave away absolutely everything to the detriment of his family could be understood as undermining the basis not only of his marriage, but also of the very way in which we've come to organise ourselves as a society. I will work in a homeless kitchen, but I will not put camp beds in my living room and invite strangers off the streets to live there. I might buy you a coat, but I probably won't give you one of my kidneys. I may not be able to tell you exactly where the limit is, but I do fear that people who ignore these limits are somehow dangerous. One answer to all of this is to pretend that extreme morality, the morality of these saints, isn't really morality at all, that it has such negative consequences for those who practice it and those who live with them and depend upon them, that there's nothing really moral about such behaviour. A priest friend of mine took up a post as a vicar in a tough parish in the northeast of England. Out of principle, he sent his children to the local school, a school that was failing and violent. Later in life, one of his children, who was badly bullied at this school, rebuked his father for his choice. He said to him, "You sacrificed my life on the altar of your principles." No father wants to hear such words from their child. In part, of course, Singer's moral imperative to do more than might be reasonably expected is a way of pitting one's responsibility as a parent or a husband against one's responsibility to strangers. And this, of course, is one of the arguments used to justify the need for a celibate priesthood. I once interviewed Peter Singer, and I rather cheekily asked him how he could justify giving Christmas presents to his children if the money could be more effectively spent on needy strangers. Even he acknowledged that there was a point at which you have to look after your own, even if that means others will go without. Human capacity has its limits, however regrettable. Interestingly, extremes of self-sacrifice are regularly praised during times of war. Those who give their lives in battle, especially those who sacrifice themselves to save another, are deemed moral heroes. Yet the same behaviour during times of peace is viewed with suspicion. Perhaps that's because in times of war, the rules of conventional bourgeois morality are suspended. The normal order of things has been broken. The most extreme biblical version of this impossible demand is surely God's instruction to Abraham that he sacrifice his son Isaac. As Kant rightly insisted, there's no possible moral system in which such a demand could ever be all right. And as Kierkegaard rightly notes, this demand takes us away from the realm of the moral into what seems to be an altogether different order of concern. Okay, so why am I telling you all of this? Because what I want to consider here is the relationship between morality and Christianity, and in particular, to have a go at the easy conflation of the two. That is, I have in my sights the familiar idea that Christianity is basically morality in story form, or that Christianity is really just an expression of moral teaching, and that shorn of its first century worldview, it's perfectly serviceable for present needs. You know the sort of thing, that Christianity is all about loving your neighbour as yourself, which is a nice enough thing to say, but as the psychoanalyst Lacan tartly observed, the problem with it is that most people don't actually love themselves. In fact, quite the reverse. In an age of widespread self-harm and the self-directed emotional violence that's now widely understood to be the root of depression, the advice to reduce Christianity to loving your neighbour as you love yourself feels inadequate. In the opening sections of John Bunyan's brilliant Pilgrim's Progress, the hero of the story, a man called Christian, comes across a figure known as Mr. Worldly Wiseman, and he's offered the opportunity to settle down in a comfortable village. Christian's journey is a journey towards salvation, but certain distractions lay in his path, and amongst the first of these is a village known significantly as morality. The village of morality offers the promise of what I've called bourgeois morality. But Christian rejects the offer of Mr. Worldly Wiseman and presses on away from morality towards a greater prize, that of the heavenly kingdom itself. The contrast being made here between morality and salvation is one that the great historian E.P. Thompson makes much of in his brilliant biography of William Blake. Blake was a particular fan of Bunyan, and indeed the exhibition of Blake's work that has just closed at the Tate Britain includes some of his beautiful illustrations for Pilgrim's Progress. But Blake goes even farther than Bunyan. For Blake, conventional morality isn't just a temptation or somehow insufficient, it's the source of all the trouble. Quote, the gospel is forgiveness of sins and has no moral precepts, said William Blake. These belong to Plato and Seneca and Nero. And going in even further in his great poem, the everlasting gospel, William Blake links morality with the forces that are lined up against Jesus at his crucifixion. He's going to read a few lines from a poem here and listen to the part that morality plays in the crucifixion of Jesus. It was when Jesus said to me, "Thy sins are all forgiven thee," the Christian trumpets loud proclaim through all the world in Jesus' name, mutual forgiveness of each vice, and open the gates of paradise. The moral virtues in great fear formed the cross and nails and spear, and the accuser standing by cried out, "Crucify, crucify." The moral virtues are here condemned as forming the instruments of Jesus' torture. Morality isn't just a distraction. This is extraordinary stuff. Morality is the enemy. Why does Blake think this? Partly, and this is Thompson's answer, because Blake subscribed to a pretty vigorous sense that faith and works were in opposition to each other. On this distinction, faith is a matter of really believing, whereas works, or works righteousness, as some of you might know it, is mere outward observance, a sort of going through the motions type of thing. And this, of course, is rooted in what was widely believed to be St. Paul's position when he talked about justification by faith. Galatians 2, for instance, we know that a person is justified not by the works of law, but through faith in Jesus Christ. I might be in danger of going off on a little tangent here for a moment, but I cannot help comment on the way that this familiar distinction between faith and works has historically and regularly been weaponized against Jews, often as a way of disparaging Judaism as a religion of mere works, that is, of simply obeying the law, and Christianity, by contrast, as being a matter of really believing it. And there is a nasty anti-Semitic undertow even to William Blake's work that is rarely discussed. As well as a number of anti-Jewish asides in his writing, it is a constant theme in Blake's paintings and poetry to depict the God of the Hebrew Scriptures as the violent, oppressive old man with a beard God, and the God of the New Testament as being all about youthful God of love and forgiveness, that sort of familiar trope. Growing out of this disparagement of Judaism, the faith-works distinction has long been a powerful tool for the interpretation of passages like the one about adultery with which I began this lecture. And if you remember, the way it's structured, it says, it used to be said by people long ago this, and now I tell you this. Out with the old, in with the new. Now, one of the most important developments of New Testament study over the last 50 years or so has been a change of mind about what Paul really meant by this distinction between faith and works. Starting with E.P. Sanders, the so-called new perspective on Paul has argued that it's a mistake to think of Judaism as a rules-based religion of moral righteousness. Instead, they argue, the rules are boundary markers that define who is in and who is not in. Who's a member of the redeemed community of Israel? Boundary markers. In other words, it's a mistake to think of Judaism as a moral religion and Christianity as a salvation religion. Judaism was just as much a salvation religion. What Paul was having a go at was that salvation was only applied to Jews. Paul was not against the law, because it was inadequate for salvation, but because it contained too restrictive a sense of who was included in God's saving plan. Okay, that's the detour, but it's important. My own sense is that Thompson makes too much of the faith-works distinction in understanding Blake's hostility to morality. Rather, I tend to the view that Blake's religion holds a very high doctrine of forgiveness And that for him, forgiveness is above all that which is problematically related to morality. And on this one, I think Blake is surely right. For although Blake does not neatly define what he takes to be conventional morality, one of its features is surely a sense of proportion, of balance, that sin must be paid for, that a moral crime needs to be answered, that some order needs to be restored, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. And the moral problem with forgiveness is that it seems to leave some crimes unanswered, some horrors unpaid for. For conventional morality, and especially when it comes to the appropriation of the idea of justice, if someone has received appropriate punishment, then their crimes have been answered and balance has been restored. If they've not received such punishment, then the proclamation of forgiveness is nothing but a cheap and empty gesture. And in the case of particularly heinous crimes, such a gesture of forgiveness is downright immoral. The philosopher John Keats neatly sums up the case against forgiveness from the perspective of morality. When blaming wrongdoers is reasonable, there's no reason to forgive them. And when blaming them is unreasonable, there's nothing to forgive. This is indeed a perfectly reasonable take on the morality of forgiveness, which is probably why Blake was also suspicious of reason, those mind-forged manacles in league with the dark satanic mills. Blake's enemy was what one might call the moral, rational, industrial complex, the sort of thinking that he believed went along with the Industrial Revolution. Blake was having none of any of this. He was a strange man, a mystic, a wanderer, a stranger to those who live in the village of morality, place described by Bunyan as those who live by honest neighbours in credit and in good fashion. Blake had little love in his heart for this conventional morality and for the way in which organisations like the Establishment Church of England had come to confuse being a good citizen with the explosive message of the Gospels. With Blake, morality and Christianity peer at each other with hostility and incomprehension from very different sides of a philosophical chasm. So here we reach the guts of the argument. What is it that divides a moral religion from a salvation religion? And there's no better place from which to examine this clash of approaches than through one of the fiercest debates of the early church, the debate between St. Augustine and his great ideological arch-enemy, the British monk Pelagius, who's always disparaged as being fat with porridge in the rhetoric having a go at him. Pelagius' message was simple and powerful. In short, be good and you'll go to heaven. For him, being good meant nothing more than keeping all the rules, God's moral rules, and the rules were the rules as laid down in the scriptures. Be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect was his big sermon idea. His argument, if God has told us to obey the rules, then it must be possible to obey the rules because God wouldn't ask us to do the impossible. And if it's possible, then it's obligatory. Like all easily communicated messages, it has a strong top line. Be good and you will receive eternal reward. Be bad and you won't. What bothered St. Augustine about Pelagius' position was the unproblematic confidence in which he believed human goodness to be just a matter of getting on with it in a no-nonsense sort of way. Augustine had a much more complicated view of human beings and of human motivation, One might say that he was someone who had been schooled in the crisis of capacity. In his Confessions, he tells us about stealing apples as a boy, of his mother's drinking habits, and above all, of the power of sexual desire within himself and his long-term relationship with an unmarried woman with whom he has a child. The worst thing about Augustine, by the way, is when Augustine becomes a bishop, he says nothing more about this woman that he has had a child with, and nothing more about the child. We know nothing about what happens to this child. And Augustine goes off and is to be a sort of fancy bishop and a saint, and these issues are not addressed. You command continence, Augustine had written. Grant what you command and command what you please. In other words, if God wants me to be sexually chaste, it's down to him to show me how to do it. It was a more philosophically sophisticated version of his witty teenage prayer. This is a great one. God grant me chastity and continence, but not yet. Pelagius was appalled by what he took to be Augustine's alibi for moral laxity. And in this regard, Pelagius is much, much closer to many modern sensibilities. Despite the fact that Pelagius was a distant theologian of the late Roman Empire, despite his thoroughgoing asceticism, his commitment to individual freedom and personal responsibility, his sense that we're all innocent until proven guilty, babies thus being innocent, and that's a big debate between Augustine and Pelagius and about the notion of original sin, his confidence that the law is able to track the fullness of our moral concerns, his passionate belief in the intrinsic goodness of human beings chimes neatly with the contemporary liberal and Western mindset. Indeed, one might even argue that it chimes with the secular liberal mindset too. This is rather important. For as one of Pelagius' most influential and effective proponents, supporters, Bishop Julian of Aclanum later argued, our moral autonomy is such that human beings are effectively, quote, emancipated from God. And if you think about it, it makes sense. If all you have to do is do the right thing, and then you go to God at the heavenly gates, and you've checklist, tick-boxed all your moral virtues, then God is basically a glorified compliance officer. He has to let you in because you've got all the boxes ticked. There isn't really any saving work for God to do except to make sure you've been a good boy or girl. When it comes to questions of right and wrong for Pelagius and of our ultimate success or failure in the whole human enterprise, it's all down to us as individuals. It's much nearer to Stoicism than it is to Christianity, Augustine insisted. Because what Augustine's messy, complicated life taught him is that human beings are riddled with a complicated set of motivations. That goodness is something that we often want as an aspiration, but something we rarely achieve without qualification. And this being the case, if God really requires human beings to be perfect as a condition of eternal reward, then in reality, God's damning the lot of us to hell. This was something that Luther was to wrestle with centuries later, concluding that if God required the unqualified goodness of human beings in order for human beings to be saved, then God was a total ... and Luther hated him. Later still in 1931, Freud makes a sort of secularized version of the same point when he wrote to Arnold Zweig, "Isn't Prince Hamlet right? If we all had our just deserts, which of us would escape a whipping?" Augustine's notion of original sin is often condemned as harsh and judgmental, as if to speak of human beings as ontologically sinful is somehow to rubbish them, to denigrate the beauty of human life. Talk of sin instinctively feels repressive, especially to the modern ear. But I think the reverse is true. For if our wills are corrupted by Adam's fall, and human beings are congenitally incapable of moral perfection, the message of original sin, then it's a profound cruelty of people like Pelagius to require perfection of us. We're being set up to fail, ladies and gentlemen. If original sin is to be criticised, it's surely from the opposite direction, that it's unduly permissive, that it provides weakness and immorality with a perfect excuse, that it places human life beyond good and evil. Augustine had another problem with Pelagius' position, a theological problem, and I've just mentioned this. It didn't give God any work to do. If we are to gain entry to heaven by ticking all the moral boxes, then God's role in human salvation is simply that of a glorified compliance officer. He's simply there to check all the boxes have been ticked. And if they have been ticked, then he has no discretion in granting to the virtuous entry to heaven or refusing it to the sinful. Effectively, salvation has been automated. Augustine argued this detracted from God's omnipotence and his discretion. Surely, God being God, he could do what he wanted. After all, heaven was his creation, and he could allow in whoever he pleased. For Augustine, salvation is top down, comes from God, not bottom up, demanded by what we're able to achieve morally. We're saved, he insists, not through any work of our own, not because of any virtue we may have acquired through our own efforts, but entirely through grace and gratuitously. That is, at God's discretion and initiative. The problem with Pelagius is that he wanted to be his own redeemer, whereas for Augustine, we don't have all that much of a hand in it. We can make our confession in all its moral ambiguity, and the rest is down to God. Pelagius was outraged. Augustine was granting human beings license to behave exactly as they wished. They could be the biggest, this text is peppered with profanity, which I'm not reading out in the cathedral. They could be the biggest XXXs of all time, and yet God could end up forgiving them and granting them salvation. Could God redeem Hitler? And if so, what of fairness? What of justice? Human life is complicated for Augustine. It's simple for Pelagius. Okay, so much for the theology. Now let me just say a little bit about how this stuff about the crisis of capacity might work out in ordinary church-going lives. There's a woman I know, I'm going to call her Sarah, who's been struggling with a really desperate situation. At church, she befriended a really lovely woman who's just escaped from Iran after the authorities raided her house group and took away her fellow Christians to God knows what ghastly fate. This Iranian woman, let me call her Nahid, escaped from Iran to Turkey, hidden in the back of a vegetable truck. This is a true story. Leaving behind a well-paid job at the university, she had no choice but to put herself in the hands of people traffickers who put her on a flight to Manchester. Not knowing a soul in this country, Nahid made her way to London looking for work and for shelter. She came to church, and Sarah took pity on her and offered her a bed in her house. So far, so good. The problem was, however, that Sarah had just got married, about to move in with her new husband, and the house in which she offered Nahid shelter was on the market, and there was no bedroom for her in the new house. Sarah was frantic. As the sale of her property was approaching completion, she spent days and days trying to get Nahid a room and to get her work. Even though Nahid had been accepted by the Home Office as a legitimate asylum seeker, it was proving impossible to persuade would-be employers to take her on, despite the fact that she had considerable qualifications. Sarah had been financially supporting Nahid. She persuaded other members of the church to help financially support her too. But the burden started to get crippling, and the situation seemed unsustainable. One Sunday, Sarah arrived in church at her wit's end. Nahid was facing eviction, and she had nowhere else to go. The local authorities said that Nahid was not their responsibility. Sarah was close to breaking point. Even her faith was being tested. Church must do more for Nahid, she insisted, more. And she was right. But our little church was also supporting a number of other people in desperate situations. The Romanian guy who sleeps by the bins, the young chap who speaks no English and whose mother had recently passed away in unspeakably miserable circumstances. Now, naturally, you want to know how this situation turned out, and the truth is that I do not know. The situation is ongoing. It's happening today, and it's indeed tragic. At times in church, we feel crushed by the weight of demand. And we are aware that there are times when our capacity runs out. That we sit in the pews and that we cry that the world is thus and that we have reached the end of what we're capable of. We have been beaten. Of course, the church is a place of moral concern. I'm not denying that. But it's also a space, and perhaps it's unique in this regard, where we can go and take our failures and where our failures can be just placed, articulated, and held. We're better a place to articulate a crisis of capacity, our I can do no more, than before the cross, that instrument of extreme horror and violence, before which even Jesus himself spoke of being forsaken by God. For many, this is the place to come when the words on our lips are morally, I cannot fix this, I cannot do more. This is the point at which religion makes a leap from being a matter of moral concern to a place of salvation and our need for it. This is why I think the best semi-secular model of what the church should look like is probably that of Alcoholics Anonymous. The first 3 of its famous 12 steps requires an acceptance of what I've called the crisis of capacity. Substitute the word alcohol for the word sin, and you have the core of what I've been getting at. Here are the first 3 steps of the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. Admit that we're powerless over alcohol and that lives have been unmanageable. 2, come to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. 3, make a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understand him. Yes, the church employs a different vocabulary to AA, but the way it speaks about human life is remarkably similar. Fundamentally, it's not about being good, it's about being saved. When he was nothing but a suspended carcass, dripping with his own blood and other people's spit, there were no worshippers around clapping their hands and singing their hymns. They were long gone. At the very end, ironically, at the moment of greatest triumph, he had no followers left. They'd all run away. This says something profoundly counterintuitive about what a successful church might look like. For the core of the Christian message, death first, then resurrection, is so existentially full on that no one can possibly endure it. Then a church that successfully proclaims the message, this message, is likely to be empty and not full. Which is also quite possibly why a successful priest ought to be hated rather than feted. For here, as elsewhere in the Christian story, success and failure are inverted. The first will be last and the first will be last and the last first. The rich cast down and the poor exalted. The true king is crowned with mockery and thorns, not with gold and ermine. Christianity, ladies and gentlemen, properly understood, is a religion of losers. It's the worst of playground insults. For not only do we not want to be a loser, we don't even want to associate with losers. We pointedly shun losers as if some of their loserness might rub off on us. Or rather, more honestly, we shun losers because others might recognize us amongst their number. And we secretly fear that this might be true. We shun them all the more viciously, thus to distance ourselves all the more emphatically. We're not losers, we say. And so the cock crows 3 times. But it is true. Deep failure, the failure of our lives, is something that we occasionally contemplate in the middle of the night, in those moments of terrifying honesty before we get up and dress for success. Ecce homo, said Pilate. Behold the man. This is humanity. And the facade of success we present to the world is commonly a desperate attempt to ward off this knowledge of our failure. At the beginning of Lent, Christians are reminded of this in the most emphatic of ways. Know that you are dust, and to dust you shall return, the priest will tell you. Those who use the period of Lent to give things up are invited to live life stripped bare, experiencing humanity in the raw, without the familiar props to our ego. It's got nothing to do with being better people or the avoidance of chocolate. It's everything to do with the unvarnished truth about human failure. There is no way that the top 100 business leaders would endorse the cross. It's life without the advertising, without the accoutrements of success. It's life on a 0 hours contract where at any moment we can be told that we are not needed. And here's the thing, the Christian story, like the best sort of terrifying psychoanalysis, strips you down to nothing in order for you to face yourself anew. This is the crisis of capacity. For it turns out that losers are not despised or rejected, not ultimately. In fact, losers can discover something about themselves that winners won't ever appreciate. That they are loved and wanted simply because of who they are and not because of what they can achieve. That despite it all, raw humanity is glorious and wonderful and entirely worthy of love. This is revealed theologically precisely at the greatest point of dejection. The resurrection is not a conjuring trick with bones. It's a revelation that love is stronger than death, stronger than failure, that human worth is not indexed to worldly success, moral or otherwise. In a world where we semaphore our successes to each other at every possible opportunity, including what is called virtue signaling, churches cannot be blamed for failing to live up to this austere and wonderful message. The worst churches judge their successes in entirely worldly terms by counting their followers. Their websites show images of happy, uncomplicated, moral people doing good, improving stuff in the community. But if I'm right about the meaning of Christ's passion, then a church is at its best when it fails and it recognizes that we are failures. When it gives up on all the ecclesiastical glitter, when the weeds start to break through the floor, and when it shows others that failure is nothing of the sort. That's why the cross is the real site of triumph, the moment of great success. Because our failure is recognized and then redeemed. Alleluia.